Why was Buddhism erased in the very land of the Buddha's birth? In the long, rugged current of Indian history, one name resounds like a bronze bell echoing across the centuries. Emperor Ashoka the Great, a ruler hailed by posterity as the Dharma king, who carried Buddhism from a fresh, still young religion to a light that covered nearly the entire subcontinent. The story of Ashoka the Great is not only a political anecdote, but also an epic of spiritual transformation, the beginning of the later tragedy in which Buddhism blazed to a brilliant peak and then declined right in its homeland. In the 3rd century BCE, India was under the rule of the Maurya dynasty, one of the largest empires the land had ever seen. Its founder was Chandragupta Maurya, but it was under his grandson, Ashoka the Great, that the realm reached its zenith. Born into royalty, Ashoka was in his youth strong-willed, once regarded as fierce and warlike. Upon taking the throne, he launched many campaigns to expand his territory, and the fateful turning point was the conquest of Kalinga, a fertile region on the eastern coast. The Kalinga War entered the chronicles as a blood-soaked scar. Over 100,000 soldiers and civilians fell within just a few months. Rivers ran red, fields became graveyards. Ashoka the Great, the victorious emperor, walked among the dead with a heart torn open. He saw the pleading eyes of children, the desperate cries of women, the groans of the dying. In that very moment, the ever-victorious king awoke. He realized that glory won by sword and spear brings only blood and tears, that victory is in fact the defeat of our humanity. Out of that shock, Ashoka the Great turned to the Buddha's teaching. He took refuge in the Triple Gem, upheld the precepts, and vowed to use an emperor's power to protect the Dharma. Human history has rarely witnessed a transformation so profound. From a ruthless conqueror, Ashoka the Great became a sovereign who made compassion his guiding star. After Kalinga, Ashoka the Great decreed an end to all conquests by arms. He erected stone pillars across the realm, inscribed with edicts and teachings on kindness, nonviolence, filial piety, and tolerance for all beings. These pillars stood throughout India, from the northern plains to the southern forests, so that all subjects could read them and imbibe the spirit of the Dharma. Each column was like a torch set upright between heaven and earth, proclaiming that this was an empire walking the path of righteousness. He did not stop at home. Ashoka the Great also made Buddhism a bridge of diplomacy. He sent envoys bearing the Dharma across the sea to Sri Lanka, over the Himalayas to Tibet, and along trade routes to Greece and Central Asia. Thus were Buddhist seeds sown across Asia. Sri Lanka received the early teaching and made it the state religion. Central Asia preserved Sanskrit scriptures that later moved into China. Even the distant Greek world saw the footprints of Ashoka's envoys, allowing some Western philosophers to hear of a compassionate path from the East. Under Ashoka the Great, Buddhism was not merely a religion but also a political and social foundation. He established hospitals for people and even for animals, dug wells, built roads, and set up rest houses for travelers. All policies were steeped in compassion. One of the largest empires of the ancient world, instead of resting on violence, chose morality as its root. This was a time when Buddhism reached an unprecedented summit. Memorial stupas and majestic Buddha statues were raised everywhere, becoming enduring symbols. From countryside to city, people knew the Buddha's teachings. The Sangha traveled in all directions, planting moral seeds in the hearts of the populace. Buddhism became the spiritual force that knit together a vast empire. Yet within this flourishing lay the seed of a paradox. When Buddhism relied on political power to spread, its existence became bound to the dynasty's fate. After Ashoka the Great passed, the Maurya court gradually weakened. His successors no longer cherished the Dharma. From there the radiance began to fade. But in the memory of history, Ashoka's reign forever stands as the golden age of Buddhism on Indian soil. Today, standing before the remaining pillars of Ashoka the Great, we can still feel the echo of the past. The inscriptions, though worn by wind and rain, still tell of a monarch who dared to transform himself to transform his people. They testify that the power of the Dharma can soften even a ruthless conqueror, turning him into one who sows the seeds of compassion among humankind. But history is impermanent. Prosperity, then decline, light, then darkness. Ashoka the Great lit a blazing torch, yet that torch had to face the tempests of its time. From that golden height, Buddhism would gradually enter a long descent and, in the end, be erased in the very land of its birth. Even as the light of Ashoka's pillars remained etched into India's earth, shadows had already begun to creep in. The death of the Dharma king closed not only a dynasty, but opened a prolonged period of instability for Buddhism itself. Without a righteous sovereign of sufficient stature to uphold it, the Sangha had to stand on its own. And in precisely that period, the seeds of division sprouted, slowly eating away at a once vibrant life force. At first, the differences were merely scholarly debates. Some groups held fast to the original ascetic spirit, emphasizing the keeping of precepts and the practice of meditation. They were those later called the Elders' School, developing into the so-called Lesser Vehicle. Meanwhile, other groups broadened doctrine, elevating universal compassion, affirming that all beings can become Buddhas and that liberation is not reserved for a few. They were the seeds of the Great Vehicle. At first glance, this was only diversity, but over time, difference became distance. Debates did not stay on the path's principles. They spread across the whole Sangha. In some places, the two sides even attacked one another, branding the other as heretical. In a society where Buddhism had once been a unifying thread, those very threads began to snap. Meanwhile, the Maurya dynasty quickly fell into decline. The successors lost interest in the Dharma. They returned to the Brahmanical rites deeply rooted in culture. With the weakening of patronage, the Sangha no longer had the resources it enjoyed under Ashoka the Great. Monasteries began to depend on lay donations. But the laity, too, were no longer as attached as before, for they felt Buddhism had grown distant, merely a place where lofty scholars quarreled over words. At the same time, Hinduism, the transformed form of Brahmanism, rose vigorously. It cleverly absorbed parts of Buddhist thought to strengthen itself. New mythic tales were fashioned. Deities such as Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma were exalted in radiant glory. Especially, it offered a devotional system that felt close to the people, with lively festivals and colorful rituals that made them feel warmer than the austerity of Buddhist philosophical disputations. Within the Sangha, divisions continued. Each branch built its own system of reasoning and its own canon. Some inclined toward prajna, some emphasized yogacara, and some developed tantra with esoteric rites. These ideas were indeed rich and profound, but they also made Buddhism more complex and harder for ordinary people to grasp. They no longer saw the simple image of the ascetic Sakyamuni beneath the Bodhi tree. Instead, they saw abstruse doctrines beyond their reach, dividing the Sangha not only in doctrine but also in daily life. A segment fell into ritualistic formalism. Monasteries grew increasingly wealthy, owning land and treasure. Many monks lived in comfort, drifting away from the original ideals. Criticism from the populace grew louder. People told stories that in some places monks cared only about scrambling for profit and competing for reputation, while forgetting the mission of guiding beings. All of this caused Buddhism, once a blazing fire under Emperor Ashoka the Great, to begin to dim. Although many great centers of learning still remained, their light seemed to shine only within scholarly circles. In the hearts of the people, it gradually cooled. This was precisely the stage when Buddhism weakened itself from within. A religion born to break the chains of caste became entangled in the very chains of abstruse knowledge and elaborate ritual. A religion that began with the simplicity of alms-begging slipped into a life of luxury within monasteries. A religion once intimately tied to the suffering of the masses now stood apart, looking down from an ivory tower of scholarship. History shows that when there is internal division, any religion or dynasty easily declines. Indian Buddhism after Ashoka the Great followed exactly this rule. Internal fragmentation not only destroyed the strength of unity, but also opened space for other religions to rise and fill the void. Hinduism did not miss the opportunity. It took advantage of this weakness to regain influence in the court and among the people. From the blazing torches of Ashoka's era, there now remained only flickering candles in the monasteries. Outside, the populace was fervent in festivals of the gods. Inside, scholars argued over each sentence and word of the scriptures. That scene foretold a great tragedy drawing near. Buddhism had once reached the summit of glory, but now was losing its place even before any foreign invasion. And it was precisely this division that would mean, when the storm of invasion swept in from the west, the bloodthirsty Islamic armies, Buddhism would no longer have the strength to resist. How can a house divided within stand firm against the tempests without? While Buddhism was floundering in endless debates and internal rifts, from within Indian society another force began to surge like a tide that washed away every remaining trace. It was Hinduism, the religion born of the transformation and revival of Brahmanism, a tradition that had taken root thousands of years before the Buddha appeared. The Brahmins, whose power had once been shaken by Buddhism, refused to be buried in the past. They skillfully adopted Buddhism's very strengths to restore their position. Instead of relying solely on the austere, ancient Vedas, they introduced new myths and grand epics such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. In these, the spirit of combat, loyalty, and divine protection was exalted, striking at the popular psyche that loved vivid, lively tales. Hinduism did not hesitate to absorb the spirit of compassion, charity, rebirth, and karma, the core of the Buddha's teaching. But it reinterpreted them through powerful deities: Vishnu as protector, Shiva as destroyer and regenerator, David as the grantayer of blessings. People no longer needed to seek profound philosophy. They only needed to place their faith in the gods. The gods could manifest, could grant blessings immediately, something that a slow path to liberation requiring rigorous practice, like Buddhism, could hardly satisfy. Kings, who needed a religion to shore up their authority, quickly recognized Hinduism's value. Grand sacrificial rites and myths about gods ruling the cosmos became ideal tools to sacralize royal power. The king was the incarnation of Vishnu, the beloved child of Shiva. Political authority and religious authority fused into a solid rampart that Buddhism could not surmount. Hindu temples rose one after another, magnificent like fortresses, architecture intricately carved, festivals jubilant, music and horns resounding. The people were drawn in by the bustling atmosphere, while Buddhist monasteries grew ever quieter, with only the sound of sutra recitation echoing in closed lecture halls. The contrast was like a tragic play, one side blazing bright, the other fading away. Hinduism not only regained its position but spread across the subcontinent. Music, the Gupta dynasty, and later smaller kingdoms in the north and south, all chose Hinduism as the state religion. Meanwhile, Buddhism, once nourished by the power of the Maurya Empire, lost its political backing. Without support from the court, monasteries had to rely on lay donations. But the people had already returned to familiar gods and colorful festivals. Indians felt Hinduism was closer to them because it did not require harsh meditative discipline or lofty intellect to grasp abstruse philosophy. They only needed sincere prayer and offerings to feel at peace. Meanwhile, Buddhism gradually came to be seen as a religion of scholars, too alien to everyday life. This shift occurred not only among commoners, but also in the court. Rulers seeking to assert themselves before their subjects always found Hinduism more useful. A king cloaked in the title incarnation of Vishnu could legitimize his throne, something Buddhism, which exalted non-self, could not confer. Hence, when faced with a choice between two paths, most dynasties leaned toward Hinduism. The result was that Buddhism was pushed out of the center of society. Hindu temples were packed with devotees, while Buddhist temples grew ever emptier. The Sangha, already fragmented, became more isolated. They turned into a minority within a society whose faith had changed hue. Hinduism also used art skillfully to win hearts. Colossal statues of gods, brilliant murals depicting Vishnu sleeping upon the cosmic ocean, Shiva dancing within a ring of destructive fire, and David triumphing over demons impressed themselves deeply upon the people's minds. These images were dramatic and lively, contrasting with the stillness and quietude of the meditating Buddha. This contrast made Buddhism even more overshadowed. Gradually, Buddhism no longer held the role of a lamp illuminating Indian society. It remained only a small stream, surviving in certain monasteries, serving a circle of scholars and monastics. Meanwhile, Hinduism became a vast ocean covering everything. The rise of Hinduism was indeed a heavy blow to Buddhism, but not a mortal one. It merely weakened the Dharma, pushing it back into the background. The true tragedy came only when storms from outside crashed down, Islamic armies with swords and flames, sweeping away what remained. Yet without Hinduism's earlier powerful resurgence, Buddhism would not have been so enfeebled as to collapse so easily. In history, what once shone brightly is often replaced by new currents. That is the law of impermanence that the Buddha himself taught. The rise and fall of Indian Buddhism did not lie outside that law. After the golden radiance of Ashoka the Great's era, after prolonged internal division and fragmentation, the rise of Hinduism marked yet another milestone on the downward path. And that was only the prelude to a greater tragedy waiting ahead. When Hinduism had risen and regained a firm foothold in society, Buddhism, though weakened among the populace, still retained a certain pride, the great centers of learning that the ancient world admired. If the light of faith in the villages had gradually dimmed, then within the red brick walls of the Buddhist universities, the lamp of wisdom still burned brightly, shining in all directions. Among them, Nalanda was the brightest jewel. Founded in the 5th century CE, Nalanda was not merely a school, but an entire academic city. Its campus stretched over dozens of hectares, with thousands of classrooms, dozens of temples and stupas, and a vast library filled with scriptures. It is said that Nalanda's library comprised 3 great buildings, one of them 9 stories high, containing hundreds of thousands of texts on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. It was a priceless treasure of the medieval world. Thousands of monks and scholars gathered there not only from across India but also from China, Tibet, Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka, and even Central Asia. Eminent Chinese monks like Xuanzang and Yijing once crossed countless snowy mountains and scorching deserts to study at Nalanda. In their records, Nalanda appears as a kingdom of knowledge, classrooms echoing with recitation, corridors filled with monastics and discussion, gardens bustling with travelers' footsteps. Not only Nalanda, Vikramashila, founded by King Jarmapala in the 8th century, was also a major center, particularly for the development of Tantra. There, esoteric rites were systematized and great philosophers were trained. There were also Odantapuri, Jagadala, and Somapura, other monastic universities forming an interconnected network that bound Buddhist scholarship across northern India. Within those red-fired brick walls, human intellect reached a summit. Masters debated with piercing logic. Voluminous treatises were produced. Elaborate philosophical systems were constructed. Not only Buddhist philosophy but also medicine, astronomy, and linguistics were studied. Nalanda was once regarded as the world's first international university, a gathering place for the finest intellects of humanity. Yet within that very splendor lay a paradox. Buddhism increasingly withdrew into academic centers, growing distant from everyday life. Laborers, peasants, craftsmen, once freed by Buddhism from the chains of caste, now felt the Dharma existed only at the school gates. While Hinduism overflowed outside with festivals, rituals, and music, Buddhism shone only within high brick walls. A lamp of wisdom without the winds of life to fan, it will sooner or later become a flame that burns itself out. That was the fate of the monastic universities. However brilliant their light, when foreign invaders arrived they became prime targets. For there were not only scriptures there, but also gold and treasure, and above all, the symbols of a religion that had once challenged every power. It is said that in those years Nalanda stood like a stronghold of the Dharma. Each day scholars gathered to debate the nature of reality, dependent origination, and mind. Monks trained in ritual, taught the Dharma, and translated scriptures. Everything seemed indestructible. But precisely when the light reached its brightest, darkness had already begun to gather in silence. Medieval India was no longer unified like the Maurya Empire. The land was divided into many small states. Hindu and Buddhist dynasties coexisted, yet lacked the military strength to protect themselves. When Islamic armies from the west swept in seeking wealth and territory, rich centers like Nalanda and Vikramashila became fat prey. And because Buddhism no longer had strong political backing, those monasteries could rely only on brick walls and faith, things far too fragile before swords and flames. Scholarly glory has never been enough to shield a religion from foreign powers. Nalanda and the other great universities, those symbols of wisdom, could not stand against the tempests of history. They were like splendid palaces built on sand. A single great wave would bring them down. And indeed, that wave was about to break, bearing the name of Islamic expeditions. But let us not speak of catastrophe yet. At that time, Nalanda was still a source of pride. Rows of red brick stupas glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Bells resounded across the Ganges plain. Teachings flowed like a stream without end. The monks still believed they were guarding an immortal lamp of wisdom. No one could have imagined that only a few centuries later, all would be burned to ash and reduced to silent ruins. Seen from today, the story of these centers of knowledge is like lightning before a storm. A brilliant but fleeting glare, the brighter it burns, the more tragic its extinguishing. By their very grandeur, they left later generations proof that Buddhism once enjoyed a radiant golden age, while also proving that nothing can defy the law of impermanence in history. The red brick walls of Nalanda, Vikramashila, or Odapuri still seemed to echo with chants, but outside, India's political winds were shifting. After mighty dynasties like Maurya or Gupta collapsed, the country no longer had a unified power to shelter Buddhism. Fragmented principalities and small Hindu courts arose everywhere, and to them, Buddhism was no longer a priority. Political power is the umbrella that shelters any religion. While Ashoka the Great lived, Buddhism was protected by the Maurya court, with abundant treasuries, military defense, and supportive edicts. But when that light faded, the Sangha faced a harsh reality. Without kings standing behind it, Buddhism became fragile. The new ruling class, mostly adherents of Hinduism, no longer cared to patronize temples. They returned to sacrificial rites to the gods, organizing lavish festivals to bolster prestige. Meanwhile, Buddhist temples grew ever quieter, and royal and aristocratic donations dried up. The great monasteries tried to carry on with lay support, but without state coffers, feeding thousands of monks became difficult. The people, already estranged from Buddhist doctrine, could no longer sustain massive establishments like Nalanda. The monks had to find ways to hold on. In some places they relied on farmland, collected rents, and turned monasteries into landed estates. But that only deepened resentment, for the image of a Sangha linked with simplicity turned into that of landlords in saffron robes. Alongside this, Hindu courts viewed Buddhism with suspicion. They saw it as a rival that had once overshadowed Brahmanism and thus did not wish to give it a chance to revive. By channeling resources to Hindu temples and to the Brahmin class, the kings, in effect, pushed Buddhism back into the shadows. In that landscape, there were only a few exceptions. In eastern India, the Pala kings from the 8th to the 12th centuries still supported Buddhism, especially Tantra. It was they who built Vikramashila, Jagadala, and Somapura, great monasteries that followed in Nalanda's footsteps. Yet brilliant as it was, this patronage was only a passing breeze. The Pala Empire was not strong enough to withstand other forces, and when it declined, what they had built fell into the hands of enemies. Buddhism therefore survived in a fragile balance. It was no longer a religion of the entire people, but one confined to certain regions and a few courts. Meanwhile, Hinduism expanded steadily, bound tightly to political power and nourished by the state treasury. In precisely that context, the Sangha narrowed further. Many monks had to leave the monasteries and return to lay life. Those who remained concentrated in the great monasteries, devoting themselves to the study of scriptures. They produced magnificent scholarly achievements, yet grew ever more distant from the masses. Ordinary people no longer saw Buddhism in daily life, but only as a lofty world behind red brick walls. Without the patronage of the courts, Buddhism also lost the ability to protect itself. When wars and chaos broke out, when bands of raiders and armies from outside poured in, temples easily became targets. While Hindu shrines were guarded by the court and soldiers, Buddhist monasteries could only hope for luck. This was the deep reason Buddhism could not stand firm when the wave of Islamic invasions arrived. Had there been a powerful dynasty at its back, the monasteries might have been defended, but history allowed no such thing. When swords from the West advanced, Buddhism no longer had any support, no dynasty raising a banner to protect the Dharma. Thus, although its scholarly light still shone within, Buddhism was abandoned on the political battlefield outside. It was like a caravan in the desert, carrying treasure within but lacking water without. Sooner or later, that caravan would collapse when the sandstorm rose. Weakness caused by the loss of royal patronage was the sorrowful prelude to a tragic epic. It showed clearly that when the Dharma is cut off from political and social life, when the Sangha becomes a scattering of lonely islands, being swept away is only a matter of time. And that time was not far off, for on the western frontier the hoofbeats of Islam had begun to sound a warning of the coming storm. While Buddhism gradually withdrew behind monastery walls, on the western border a new storm was forming, the storm of Islam, bearing iron hooves and sharp swords, driven by a fervent will to conquer and a blazing religious faith. As the wheel of history turned, the entire Indian subcontinent had to endure a series of brutal upheavals, and Buddhism, already weakened, became the first victim. The invasions began in the 11th century. The Ghaznavid Empire, originating in what is now Afghanistan, repeatedly sent armies into northwestern India. The most famous figure was Mahmud of Ghazni, praised in Islamic chronicles as a warrior of holy war. For more than 20 years, Mahmud conducted dozens of expeditions into India. He targeted wealthy cities, Hindu temples rich with gold and jewels, and the splendid Buddhist monasteries. Those pounding hooves spread terror. The city of Somnath, with its magnificent temple to Shiva, was plundered, the idols smashed, the jewels carted away in wagon loads. To the Muslims, it was a triumph. To Indians, it was a nightmare. Amid those nightmares, Buddhism staggered even more. A monastery is not a military fortress. Monks do not wield swords and spears but hold scriptures, pens, and bells. When Islamic armies poured in, the fired brick walls of Nalanda or Vikramashila could not withstand flame and iron. Monks either fled, were killed, or were taken as slaves. The majesty of a centuries-old scholarly tradition dissolved into smoke and dust in an instant. At first, the expeditions were mere raids. Mahmud of Ghazni struck and withdrew, carrying spoils back north. But India's wealth aroused the ambition to settle. After the Ghaznavids came the Ghurid Empire. They not only plundered but also laid the foundations of rule, establishing Islamic dynasties on Indian soil. From that point, the storm was no longer a passing squall, but a long-rooted gale. For Buddhism, this was the beginning of tragedy. A religion that had already lost courtly support and had grown weak among the people now faced an uncompromising adversary. Islam, with its monotheistic conviction, regarded the smashing of idols and the destruction of false religions as a sacred duty. Ancient Buddha statues thousands of years old were deemed idols to be erased. Libraries full of scriptures were dismissed as useless and burned to ash. The remaining historical records tell that as Islamic armies swept across northern India, many monasteries were reduced to rubble. The chanting fell silent, replaced by the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel. No Hindu dynasty was strong enough to protect Buddhism. In some cases, Hindu elites even turned a blind eye, for Buddhism was no longer their religion. Once nurtured by Ashoka the Great, Buddhism was now abandoned like an orphan in the marketplace. Nalanda's walls still stood, but the shadow of fate lurked around them. The monks knew that if the storm truly struck, no one could save them. The scene was like a wavering lamp in the wind. The light of wisdom within the monasteries still flared. Scholars still debated passionately, still copied and translated scriptures. But outside, waves of hoofbeats had already reached the Ganges Valley, and when the whirlwind came, that lamp would be snuffed out in an instant. The first footsteps of Islam into India opened a tragedy that would last for centuries. That tragedy was not only the destruction of buildings and libraries, but the disappearance of an entire religious tradition in its own homeland. The bitter truth is that Buddhism did not collapse for lack of wisdom. It collapsed for lack of political support, because it had weakened from within before the storm arrived. The ancients said, "Water wears away stone, yet a tempest sweeps everything clean." Indian Buddhism was the stone worn down for centuries by Hinduism and internal division. Then, when the storm came, that stone shattered and turned to dust. The campaigns of Mahmud of Ghazni were only the prelude. He came to plunder, then withdrew north, leaving behind desolate cities and half-burned monasteries. But history did not stop there. After the Ghaznavids, a new power rose from the mountains of Afghanistan, determined not only to plunder but to rule. This was the Ghurid Empire, and from their very footsteps, the fate of Indian Buddhism was truly sealed. At the head was Muhammad Ghuri, a patient warrior, less ostentatious than Mahmud, but far more deeply ambitious. He did not merely want to carry gold and silver back to his capital. He wanted to plant the Islamic banner in the very heart of the Ganges plain, turning India into the land of Allah. In the 12th century, Ghurid armies advanced into Punjab and then spread to Bihar and Bengal. On their march, they carried a flame of hatred for heresy and a thirst to establish a new kingship. Buddhism at this time was like an ancient tree rotten within, its bark still green, but its core hollow. Great monasteries such as Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Odanapuri still stood with thousands of monks, still resounded with bells and wooden clappers, but they were no longer protected by any court, nor guarded by any army. When the Ghurid horsemen arrived, these monasteries became rich prey, not only for their treasures, but because they symbolized an opposing religion. In the eyes of Islamic warriors, Buddha images were idols to be destroyed, scriptures were heretical books to be burned, and monks were infidels to be eliminated or converted. Religious conviction fused with the urge to conquer turned them into a raging tempest. And that tempest did not cease until nearly every trace of Buddhism on Indian soil had vanished. Surviving accounts say that when the Ghurid forces entered Bihar, where many monasteries were concentrated, they met no resistance. The monks knew only to chant and pray. Some fled, some were captured, some fell right at the monastery gates. Flames roared through the libraries. Palm leaf manuscripts caught quickly. The fire burned unbroken for many days. People said the smoke from Nalanda filled the sky and dimmed the moon. If Nalanda was the heart of Buddhist scholarship, Vikramashila was the soul of Tantra. Their thousands of practitioners of esoteric rites were trained. But to the Ghurid army, it was all sorcery. Vikramashila was fiercely assaulted. Monks were slain or scattered to Nepal and Tibet. A center once on par with Nalanda, once welcoming scholars from across Asia, was reduced to a heap of ruins. The tragedy was that not only Buddhist scriptures were destroyed, but secular knowledge as well: mathematics, medicine, astronomy, linguistics. Intellectual achievements accumulated over centuries were consumed by the flames. Humanity lost a vast treasure in a matter of days. It was one of the greatest losses in the history of civilization. Meanwhile, smaller monasteries such as Odanapuri, Jagadala, and Somapura collapsed in turn. None could stand. An entire network of intellect, an entire educational system, was like a tall tower swept by a storm, toppling one after another. From a position of scholarly pride, Buddhism suddenly plunged into an abyss. The surviving monks sought escape routes. They crossed the Himalayas into Tibet, carrying a few scriptures. They followed merchant ships to Burma and Thailand, spreading into Southeast Asia. They went to China and Japan, helping to further brighten the Buddhist cultures there. The light of the Dharma did not go out completely. It spread to the four quarters. But in its motherland of India, it was snuffed out without mercy. For the Indian people, the rise of Islam was not just a change of dynasties. It was the end of an era of culture. Temples that had been places of festival, healing, and education became piles of desolate brick. People had to turn to Hindu shrines or mosques for spiritual support. Buddhism, already receded, now disappeared entirely from daily life. The stark grandeur of history lies here. Buddhism did not die in the glory of battle, did not die in a heroic clash. It died in silence, in abandonment. No uprising broke out to defend Nalanda. No army stood forth to shield Vikramashila. Only elderly monks clutching scriptures, trembling as the flames devoured a whole treasury of knowledge. The Ghurid Empire too would decline, yielding to successor Islamic dynasties such as the Delhi Sultanate. But what they left behind could never be restored, a mortal, fatal blow to Indian Buddhism. After that wave, Buddhism in its homeland could never rise again. It survived only in memory, in ruins, in sorrowful tales told to later generations. Looking back, the harshness of history is plain. Had Buddhism not been weakened beforehand, had the Sangha remained close to the common folk, had there been a strong dynasty to protect the Dharma, Perhaps the Ghurid storm could not have swept everything away. But if is nothingness. In reality, when Islam arrived, Buddhism no longer had the strength to resist. And so, within a few decades, a tradition that had shone for 1,000 years disappeared from the land of its birth. Among all the blood-soaked calamities borne by Indian Buddhism, none left a wound so deep as the day Nalanda sank into a sea of fire. Nalanda, the pride of humanity, the pearl of ancient scholarship, one of Asia's greatest centers of learning, was destroyed on a fateful morning of the 12th century. The man who led the death-bringing army was Bakhtiyar Khilji, a general of the Ghurid Empire. He was neither philosopher nor statesman. He was merely a bloodthirsty conqueror who believed his sacred mission was to break every heresy and raise the Islamic banner over every captured land. And Nalanda, with its colossal red brick walls, its immense libraries, and its thousands of saffron-robed monks, became the prime target. Ancient records say that when Khilji's army arrived, Nalanda had almost no means of defense. It was not a military fortress. The monks were accustomed to pens and scriptures, not swords and bows. Brick walls, however sturdy, could not withstand fire and steel. When the soldiers poured in, they cut down anyone in their path. Monks fell in the monastery courtyards, their blood soaking the bricks that had borne the footsteps of generations of scholars. Yet what pains posterity most is not only the slaughter, but the flames that consumed the treasury of knowledge. Nalanda's library, holding hundreds of thousands of sutras, treatises, and works on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, was set ablaze. The manuscripts burned fiercely, flames billowed high, leaping from building to building. It is said the fire raged for months, smoke blackening the sky, a red glare lighting the plains. Works distilled from centuries of intellect turned to ash in moments. Imagine it: precious Sanskrit scriptures, meticulous commentaries by great masters, medical texts that might have saved tens of thousands of lives, mathematical and astronomical works unmatched in much of the ancient world, all suddenly reduced to cinders. This was not only a loss for Buddhism, but for all humankind. A library to rival Alexandria in Egypt was annihilated, leaving a void that can never be filled. People say that as the blaze rose, some monks dashed into the fire to save books, but were blocked by spears. Some clutched scriptures to their chests and finally fell beneath the enemy's lances. Some escaped, carrying a few volumes. And it was precisely those fragments that later traveled with them to Tibet, Nepal, and China. But compared with the vast trove lost, what remained was but a drop in the sea. That day's scene, if we picture it again, can only be called an apocalypse for Indian Buddhism. Cries mingled with the clash of weapons, the crackle of burning books, the crash of falling Buddha statues, together forming a dirge of calamity. Nalanda, which had once welcomed Xuanzang and Yijing, which had once been renowned across Asia, was now only a heap of ashes. After that devastation, Indian Buddhism had effectively lost its heart. Nalanda was not merely a monastery, it was a symbol. When the symbol collapsed, the faith of monks and devotees collapsed with it. Without Nalanda, without a center that gathered scholars, Buddhism lost its sturdy pillar. Other monasteries, even if they remained, trembled before their fate. And indeed, not long after, Vikramashila and Odanapuri met the same end. The tragedy of Nalanda was not merely the death of a school, it was the period's final punctuation. From then on, Buddhism in India fell into darkness, with no strength left to revive. Monks scattered, some converted to Hinduism or Islam to survive, some fled far away, some perished in the flames. Only ruins remained, only memory remained. Today, when you step onto the remnants of Nalanda and Bihar, you see only foundations, collapsed walls, empty corridors. Yet if you listen closely, you can still imagine the chanting of old, still see the figures of thousands of saffron-robed monks passing by, still smell the smoke lingering in history's memory. Nalanda is gone, but the pain of Nalanda is immortal. That tragedy was the death sentence for Indian Buddhism. From a golden center, the Dharma became an estranged name in its own homeland. And the bitterest truth of all, it did not die of natural decline, but was destroyed by foreign violence, while its own inner strength was no longer sufficient for self-defense. Nalanda burned, and with it a Buddhist civilization burned. The flames consumed not only books, but hope itself. From that point on, darkness shrouded the Buddha's land, and only centuries later were the ruins unearthed to retell the sorrowful tale. But the memory of that fateful day will forever be a scar in human history. If Nalanda could be considered the heart of Buddhist scholarship, then Vikramashila was the soul of Indian Vajrayana. Founded in the 8th century under the Pala dynasty, Vikramashila was in no way inferior to Nalanda in scale or stature. It gathered thousands of monks and scholars, famed for training great philosophers and tantric practitioners, those who later ushered Tibetan Buddhism into its flourishing era. Yet when the Islamic invasion swept in, Vikramashila could not escape its tragic fate and fell in a sea of fire and blood. Situated in eastern India, Vikramashila had long been the pride of the Pala kings. They built it as a citadel of intellect, a counterweight to Nalanda, to assert power and nurture the Dharma. Over generations, Vikramashila became the foremost center of Tantra. Esoteric rites, profound teachings on the nature of mind, and the union of wisdom and compassion were all systematized here. Thousands of monks came from Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal. Within its red brick walls, classrooms rang with debate, meditation halls filled with practitioners in deep absorption, and libraries housed countless precious texts. To the people of eastern India, Vikramashila was a lamp illuminating the whole region. But that light burned for only a few centuries before being extinguished in a bloody storm. After Nalanda was burned by Bakhtiyar, the Islamic armies did not stop. They pressed on into Bihar and Bengal. Their next target was Vikramashila. In their eyes, it was not only a treasure house of scriptures and wealth, but a symbol to be annihilated in order to proclaim the power of Allah. And so, on a fateful morning, the Islamic banner flew before Vikramashila's gate. The assault came swiftly. The monks, unaccustomed to weapons, knew only to close the meditation halls and clutch their scriptures in prayer. But prayers could not halt blades. Soldiers burst in, cutting down anyone they met. Monks fell beside the altars, blood washing over the brick floors that had once borne so many generations of scholars' footsteps. The sound of wooden clappers and chanting was drowned by the clash of steel and cries of despair. Vikramashila's library, the repository of tantric scriptures, records of esoteric rites, and shelves of precious books, shared the same fate. Flames leapt up, licking every shelf and every volume. Meticulous letters on palm leaves and paper turned to ash. Billowing smoke covered the sky as if smothering the last light of a civilization. It is said some monks managed to flee, carrying a few texts across the Himalayas into Tibet. Thanks to them, Vikramashila's teachings were not entirely lost. Tibet received them and developed a brilliant tantric system, later becoming a leading center of Buddhism in the world. But that was only a sliver of remaining embers. Vikramashila in India vanished completely. When the flames died, only piles of rubble were left. Broken walls, beheaded Buddha images, empty corridors, a land once bustling now hushed. The voice of teaching had fallen silent like a grave. Local people walked past quietly, afraid to speak of it, whispering only about a temple that had died. The death of Vikramashila marked the end of an academic network once comparable to any university system of the ancient world. Nalanda had fallen, Vikramashila was gone, Odantapuri and Jagadala collapsed in turn. A chain of intellectual centers knit together for centuries vanished within mere decades. It was an unprecedented catastrophe for Buddhism. For Buddhists, Vikramashila was not only a place of study but a place of practice, a repository of tantric essence. When it was destroyed, it was not merely the loss of an institution but the loss of a tradition's very soul. From then on, Indian Buddhism had no capacity to revive. The fall of Vikramashila confirmed a bitter truth. Buddhism in India had completely lost its footing in its own homeland. No academic centers, no political backing, no public faith, only fragments drifting to Tibet, Southeast Asia, and China. The Dharma lived on, but no longer in India. Today, standing amid Vikramashila's ruins, one sees only foundations, old steps, and a few mottled walls. Yet if you close your eyes, you can still hear echoes of the past, distant bells, solemn chanting, the wind carrying the scent of smoke from that fateful day. These ruins are not merely archaeological heritage. They are sorrowful witnesses to a civilization swept away. Vikramashila fell, and with it an entire golden age came to a close. From then on, Buddhism became a wandering exile, living on foreign soil, while its motherland, the place that gave birth to the Buddha, no longer bore the trace of his dharma. That is the greatest paradox, the most painful wound left by history. When Nalanda had burned to ashes and Vikramashila collapsed in blood and fire, the entire Buddhist network in India was like a great tree felled at the root. The remaining branches, Odanapuri, Jagadala, Somapura, met the same fate in turn. In a brief span, the centuries that had built a Buddhist civilization turned to cinders, and India, once the Buddha's homeland, became a land emptied of chanting. The scene of those years, if recreated, can only be called an apocalypse. Across the Ganges plain, pillars of black smoke rose from heaps of rubble. On the old temple grounds, Buddha images were beheaded. Statues lay toppled like stone corpses. Corridors once lively with scholars' footsteps now held only bodies and dust. The lamp of wisdom that had shone across Asia was snuffed out in an instant. Local people, long since inclined toward Hinduism, looked on without daring to intervene. They feared Islamic swords and felt no bond with the Sangha. In their memory, Buddhism was a religion of the past, tied to kings who were gone, no longer a living faith. So when temples burned, they kept silent and let the flames swallow everything. That indifference was the death sentence society passed on the Buddha's teaching in its own motherland. Not only scriptures and images, but the collective memory itself was gradually erased. When the monasteries were gone, the next generation had no place to learn. When the Sangha dissolved, there was no one left to pass on rites and teachings. A whole current of intellect was dammed, leaving only scattered trickles in faraway lands. In India, Buddhism faded like a ghost, with only ruins to prove it had ever been there. Some monks who survived had to convert to save their lives. They donned the white of Hinduism or the robes of Islam, leaving behind the saffron of Buddhism. Others fled into the Himalayas, to Nepal and Tibet. Some went south to Burma, Thailand, and Sri Lanka. They were the seeds that carried the Dharma out into the world. But for India, that absence was a moonless night. The most harrowing sight was the burning of the libraries. Sutras written on palm leaves and bark, lines copied with scholars' sweat and tears, were turned to ash. People said the fires at Nalanda burned for months, so that every night the sky glowed red for miles around. Those were not only flames consuming books, but flames consuming the soul of a civilization. In the ashes remained only the echo of helplessness. No army came to the rescue. No court moved to protect. Buddhism died in silence, died of abandonment, died in a sea of fire with no one to stand in its way. That death was more tragic than any military defeat, for it was not a defeat by force of arms, but a defeat because no one wished to defend it. After those seas of fire, darkness covered India. People went to worship at Hindu temples and prayed in mosques. Buddhist temples became ruins. Today, the remaining ruins, the mottled red brick walls, and deserted temple foundations still tell the tale in silence. Travelers come from everywhere, walking among the ashes to feel the pain of 1,000 years ago. In that quiet, you can still hear a distant bell, like a reminder that all things are impermanent. When Nalanda's fire died away, when Vikramashila lay in ruins, when Odantapuri and Jagadala were nothing but dust, Indian Buddhism had lost its backbone. But the death of a civilization does not play out only on the battlefield, it unfolds in daily life as well. From the 13th century onward, Buddhism no longer existed as a social force in India. It faded quietly and slowly, like a great river dwindling into scattered pools, then vanishing from the map. People who had been used to the sound of temple bells heard only the drums of Hindu shrines or the call to prayer from mosque minarets. Festivals once dedicated to the Buddha across the Ganges plain disappeared, giving way to celebrations of Vishnu and Shiva. Children raised in the new atmosphere were no longer told of Prince Siddhartha's renunciation, but only of the hero Rama and the Lord Krishna. Bit by bit, the Buddha's memory was scoured from the popular mind by the sands of time. Temples that had been community centers, where monks once treated the sick, taught children to write, and gave alms to the poor, were reduced to scorched brick walls. People no longer turned to monasteries for refuge. They turned instead to colorful Hindu rites or to the rising authority of the mosque. No one spoke of Buddhism as part of life. It survived only in vague tales of a bygone age. This vanishing made no noise, raised no smoke, yet it was more thorough than any battle. For when a religion no longer lives in a community's consciousness, it has truly died. After the 13th century, very few Indians identified as Buddhists. The Sangha had dissolved. Monks were killed, fled, or converted. There was no one left to guide or to teach. The people, long estranged from the Dharma, had no reason to return. Painfully, even Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha attained enlightenment, was neglected and fell into the hands of Hindu priests. The Mahabodhi temple, once a Buddhist holy site, was turned into a shrine to Shiva. The Buddha image was treated as a manifestation of a Hindu deity. For centuries, Buddhists around the world no longer had a place to pilgrimage to the very site of enlightenment. The Buddha's homeland, bitterly, erased his traces at the root. The social death of Indian Buddhism also appeared in the absence of lineage. Once monasteries were destroyed, scriptures burned, and masters killed, the transmission of the Dharma in India was severed. Buddhism lived strongly in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Tibet, China, and Japan. But in India itself, it vanished as if it had never existed. People still knew of the Buddha, but only as a legendary figure in the Hindu pantheon, an incarnation of Vishnu rather than an independent spiritual teacher. This disappearance is all the more tragic when we remember that only a few centuries earlier Buddhism had illuminated the entire subcontinent. Emperor Ashoka the Great had raised stone pillars everywhere and sent envoys to the four quarters. Nalanda had welcomed thousands of foreign scholars. Buddhist statues had been venerated in every village. Yet now all of it was only memory. In less than a millennium, Indian Buddhism fell from a brilliant summit into the abyss of nothingness. For the common people, its disappearance also meant the loss of a choice. Only Hinduism or Islam remained. Some chose Hinduism to preserve traditional identity. Some chose Islam for political favor. No one thought of Buddhism anymore. The very name was buried in ashes, making room for new beliefs. The surviving ruins of Nalanda, Vikramashila, and Somapura were gradually swallowed by nature. Forests grew over them. Wind and sand covered them. For centuries, passers-by saw only earthen mounds, with no idea they had once been great centers of learning. Only in the 19th century, when the British excavated them, did the world learn again that a radiant civilization had once stood there and been erased. The greatest tragedy is that Buddhism was not destroyed by a single battle, but by continuous erosion, then swept away when it was exhausted. It did not die in glory, but in oblivion. It was not only destroyed by outsiders, but also abandoned by the very people who had given it birth. That is why, when speaking of Indian Buddhism, people often mention the word paradox. The birthplace was also the burial ground. Today, when pilgrims from Thailand, Burma, Japan, and China come to India to venerate the holy sites, the locals themselves are often unfamiliar with Buddhism. They receive visitors as if greeting a foreign religion, not recognizing it as their own heritage. This is the clearest proof of Buddhism's vanishing from Indian social life. No roots, no memory, only ruins and foreign visitors returning to them. When Nalanda's last flame died, when Vikramashila was only a pile of bricks, when temple bells no longer rang in India's dawns, it seemed that Buddhism had died out completely. Yet history always has strange turns. Though driven from its homeland, the Dharma did not vanish entirely. The monks who survived that bloody storm carried the seeds of the Buddha's teaching on their backs, wandering over high mountains and broad seas to sow them on foreign soil. It was they, the exiles, who turned tragedy into the beginning of a great revival. From eastern India, many bands of monks fled to the Himalayas and made their way into Nepal and Tibet. They brought little with them. A few remaining scriptures, a few small images, several esoteric rites. Yet within that little lay the distilled essence of 1,000 years. Tibet received them like a flame from the south. In the harsh climate of the icy highlands, Indian Buddhism took on new robes and became Tibetan Buddhism, a brilliant tantric stream that radiated vitality for centuries afterward. Others went south. They followed the Bengal coast and the Bay of Bengal to Burma, then to Thailand and Laos and Cambodia, and finally took firm root in Sri Lanka. On that small island in the Indian Ocean, the seeds of the Dharma that had been preserved since Ashoka's time were watered anew. Sri Lanka became a stronghold of Theravada Buddhism, from which it spread across mainland Southeast Asia. What India lost, Southeast Asia received, tended, and developed. The maritime trade routes also carried Indian monks to Java and Sumatra. Their Buddhism blended with local culture and Hinduism, giving rise to monumental works such as Borobudur, one of the largest Buddhist monuments in the world, a testament to the powerful spread of those exiled seeds. In the north, monks went to China. Although China had long received many scriptures from India, the devastation after the 12th century added more people and fresh currents. Chinese Buddhism then continued to flourish through Chan and Pure Land traditions, influencing Korea and Japan deeply. Once rooted in East Asia, the Dharma grew in many distinct hues while retaining the original spirit of liberation from India. It can be said that this escape was the greatest migration in religious history. Buddhism was erased in its homeland even as it became a global religion. From India's ashes, the flame burned bright in other lands. This very paradox created a remarkable vitality. The more it was suppressed in one place, the more powerfully Buddhism sprouted in another. Even so, for the monks who left their homeland, it was not a glorious journey but one made in tears. They carried the pain of losing their country, their monasteries, and their fellow practitioners. They left not to expand, but to survive. Their footsteps over mountains, through forests, and across seas were marked by blood and tears. Yet from that suffering they guarded every verse and every rite as if guarding their own lives. One account says that a group of monks escaping from Vikramashila carried only a few thin scriptures hidden in bamboo tubes over the Himalayas. Along the way, many died of hunger, cold, and exhaustion, but the books were passed from hand to hand until they reached Tibet. From those fragments, an entire treasury of knowledge was recopied, translated into Tibetan, and preserved for posterity. Without those exiled footsteps, many scriptures might have been lost forever. Looking at a map of Asia after the 13th century, we see a striking reversal. In India, where the Buddha was born, his teaching had vanished. In Tibet, Southeast Asia, and East Asia, distant lands, it shone more brilliantly than ever. History flowed like a river in reverse, full of paradox yet full of power. The Sangha's flight is the clearest witness to the law of impermanence that the Buddha himself taught. Nothing abides forever in one place. All things change and flow. Buddhism left its motherland but did not die. It only transformed, was reborn in other forms, on other soils, and from there became a global religion that transcended the borders of any single nation. Today, when Buddhists from Thailand, Burma, Japan, China, and Tibet make pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya, they do not only venerate the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment, they also remember the exiled footsteps of their forebears. Thanks to those footsteps, the Dharma did not go out. Thanks to those footsteps, we can still hear the Buddha's name today, still read his scriptures, still light incense before his image. Thus the flight was not only an ending, but also a beginning. Within tragedy lay the seed of hope, within defeat, the seed of rebirth. Buddhism lost India, but gained the world. And that is the greatest paradox. From a death, the Dharma stepped into immortality. After many centuries submerged in darkness, after Buddhism had vanished from India's social life, leaving only silent ruins as witnesses, the wheel of history turned once more. This time the movement did not arise from within India, but from without, from archaeologists, from foreign Buddhists, and from the very winds of modernity. It was a late revival of Buddhism in its motherland. Beginning in the 19th century, when the British established their rule over the subcontinent, archaeological teams excavated many ruins. Nalanda, once only earthen mounds, was dug up to reveal brick walls and the foundations of classrooms and libraries. Vikramashila, Odanapuri, Somapura, all gradually emerged from the dust of time. People were astonished at the vast scale of the ancient monasteries and realized that a brilliant intellectual civilization had once flourished there. At the same time, Buddhist movements from Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, China, and Japan began returning to the Buddha's homeland. They made pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya, to the sacred Bodhi tree, to burn incense and chant. But upon arriving, they were shocked. The Mahabodhi temple had been turned into a shrine to Shiva. The Buddha image had been adorned with Hindu symbols. Buddhist rites were entirely absent. They had to struggle, persisting for decades, to regain stewardship of the holy site. An important turning point came with the movement led by Anagarika Dharmapala, a Sri Lankan Buddhist at the end of the 19th century. He launched an international campaign to restore Bodh Gaya to Buddhism. With support from Buddhists across Asia, he founded the Mahabodhi Society, organized pilgrimages, rebuilt temples, and brought monks back to reside there. Thanks to these efforts, the flame of the Dharma was gradually rekindled on the very soil where it had once been extinguished. In the 20th century, the movement grew stronger still. Buddhist countries in Southeast and East Asia contributed effort and resources to restore the holy sites. Nalanda was recognized by UNESCO, museums were established, and pilgrims arrived from around the world. Bodh Gaya became an international pilgrimage center. Each year, millions of Buddhists come to light incense under the Bodhi tree and recite the very teachings the Buddha voiced over 2,000 years ago. Yet this revival, though heartening, remains largely symbolic. Most Indians follow Hinduism or Islam and do not see Buddhism as their own faith. The majority of temples at the holy sites are maintained by foreign Buddhists. The new monasteries are built mainly to serve international pilgrims, not the spiritual needs of local people. Buddhism has returned, but as a guest in its own homeland. This is all the more poignant when we remember the past. There was a time when Buddhism was India's soul, the faith of millions, the foundation of ethics and politics. Yet now, after millennia, it can return only as ruins and spiritual tourism. It is a revival indeed, but a late one, a revival in the outlines of the past rather than in the vibrant life of the present. Even so, this belated revival has value. It reminds the world that Buddhism once blazed here. It allows Buddhists from the four corners to seek their source. Most importantly, it makes modern Indians aware that the Buddha cannot be absent from their spiritual heritage. Whether they follow Hinduism or Islam, when they see international pilgrims returning to Bodh Gaya, they recognize that this land once gave birth to a teacher who changed humanity. Today, in the chanting that rises at Bodh Gaya and the shimmering candlelight at Nalanda, we glimpse the silhouette of renewal. Though it cannot be as it once was, that presence is enough to show that Buddhism cannot be erased entirely. It only recedes, transforms, and then reappears in other forms and contexts. Viewed historically, this late revival is a strange cycle of rebirth. Buddhism was born in India, grew strong, and fell, but after wandering the four directions, it returned to its beginning. Late though it is, reduced to ruins though it may be, that return is enough to affirm. The light of the Buddha's wisdom cannot be quenched by sword or flame or the indifference of time. It will always find its way back, like an undying flame. In the long flow of human history, few paradoxes are as profound and tragic as the fate of Buddhism in India. For India is the very place where the Buddha was born, practiced, awakened, taught, and entered nirvana. It is sacred ground, where the first verses were chanted, where tens of thousands once took refuge in the Triple Gem, where Ashoka the Great raised mighty pillars to engrave the Dharma. And yet this very land became the place where Buddhism was erased, where its brightest centers were burned, where temple bells fell silent for centuries. It is a searing paradox. People often say that a river flows in many directions, but its spring never runs dry. Yet for Buddhism, the Indian spring ran dry, while far-off currents surged with life. In Tibet, Buddhism became the state religion. In Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Burma, it became the foundation of society. In China, Japan, and Vietnam, it took deep root in culture, creating a treasury of philosophy and art. Only in the place of its birth have people largely forgotten that this was once the Buddha's homeland. Buddhism left its motherland, but it did not die. It merely transformed, was reborn in another form, in other lands, and from there became a global religion that transcends the borders of any single nation. Today, when Buddhists from Thailand, Burma, Japan, China, and Tibet make pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya. They do not only venerate the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment, they also remember the exiled footsteps of their forebears. It is thanks to those footsteps that the Dharma did not go out. It is thanks to those footsteps that we can still hear the Buddha's name today, still read his scriptures, still light incense before his image. Thus the flight was not only an ending, but also a beginning. Within tragedy lay the seed of hope, within defeat, the seed of rebirth. Buddhism lost India, but gained the world. And that is the greatest paradox. From a death, the Dharma stepped into immortality. After many centuries sunk in darkness, after Buddhism had disappeared from India's social life, leaving only silent ruins as witnesses, the wheel of history turned once more. This time the movement did not arise from within India, but from without, from archaeologists, from foreign Buddhists, and from the winds of modernity itself. It was a belated revival of Buddhism in its motherland. Beginning in the 19th century, when the British established rule over the subcontinent, archaeological teams excavated many ruins. Nalanda, once only earthen mounds, was dug up to reveal brick walls and the foundations of classrooms and libraries. Vikramashila, Odanapuri, Somapura, all gradually emerged from the dust of time. People were astonished at the immense scale of the ancient monasteries and understood that a brilliant intellectual civilization had once flourished there. At the same time, Buddhist communities from Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, China, and Japan began returning to the Buddha's homeland. They made pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya, to the sacred Bodhi tree, to burn incense and chant. But upon arriving, they were shocked. The Mahabodhi temple had been turned into a shrine to Shiva. The Buddha image had been adorned with Hindu symbols. Buddhist rites were entirely absent. They had to struggle, persisting for decades, to regain stewardship of the holy site. An important turning point came with the movement led by Anagarika Dharmapala, a Sri Lankan Buddhist at the end of the 19th century. He launched an international campaign to restore Bodh Gaya to Buddhism. With support from Buddhists across Asia, he founded the Mahabodhi Society, organized pilgrimages, rebuilt temples, and brought monks back to reside there. Thanks to these efforts, the flame of the Dharma was gradually rekindled on the very soil where it had once been extinguished. In the 20th century, the movement grew stronger still. Buddhist countries in Southeast and East Asia contributed labor and resources to restore the holy sites. Nalanda was recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. Museums were established and pilgrims arrived from around the world. Bodh Gaya became an international pilgrimage center. Each year, millions of Buddhists come to light incense under the Bodhi tree and recite the very teachings the Buddha voiced more than 2,000 years ago. Yet this revival, though heartening, remains largely symbolic. Most Indians follow Hinduism or Islam and do not see Buddhism as their own faith. The majority of temples at the holy sites are maintained by foreign Buddhists. Most of the new monasteries are built primarily to serve international pilgrims rather than the spiritual needs of local people. Buddhism has returned, but as a guest in its own homeland. This is all the more poignant when we remember the past. There was a time when Buddhism was India's soul, the faith of millions, the foundation of ethics and politics. Yet now, after millennia, it can return only as ruins and spiritual tourism. It is a revival indeed, but a late revival, one in the silhouette of the past rather than in the vibrant life of the present. Even so, this belated revival has value. It reminds the world that Buddhism once blazed here. It allows Buddhists from the four quarters to seek their source. Most importantly, it makes modern Indians aware that the Buddha cannot be absent from their spiritual heritage, whether they follow Hinduism or Islam. When they see international pilgrims returning to Bodh Gaya, they recognize that this land once gave birth to a teacher who changed humanity. Today, in the chanting that rises at Bodh Gaya and the shimmering candlelight at Nalanda, we glimpse the outline of renewal. Though it cannot be as it once was, that presence is enough to show that Buddhism cannot be erased entirely. It only recedes, transforms, and then reappears in other forms and contexts. Viewed historically, this late revival is a strange cycle of rebirth. Buddhism was born in India, grew strong, and fell, but after wandering the four directions, it returned to its beginning. Late though it is, reduced to ruins though it may be, that return is enough to affirm. The light of the Buddha's wisdom cannot be quenched by sword or flame or the indifference of time. It will always find its way back like an undying flame. In the long flow of human history, few paradoxes are as profound and tragic as the fate of Buddhism in India. For India is the very place where the Buddha was born, practiced, awakened, taught, and entered nirvana. It is sacred ground, where the first verses were chanted, where tens of thousands once took refuge in the Triple Gem, where Ashoka the Great raised mighty pillars to enshrine the Dharma. And yet this very land became the place where Buddhism was erased, where its brightest centers were burned, where temple bells fell silent for centuries. It is a searing paradox. People often say that a river runs in many directions, but its spring never runs dry. Yet for Buddhism, the Indian spring ran dry, while distant currents surged with life. In Tibet, Buddhism became the state religion. In Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Burma, it became the foundation of society. In China, Japan, and Vietnam, it took deep root in culture, creating a treasury of philosophy and art. Only in the place of its birth have people largely forgotten that this was once the Buddha's homeland. History closes with a paradox. The birthplace is also the place of loss. Yet from the ashes of that loss, new life was sown across the world. And that is the story's final message. Buddhism may perish in one land, but it cannot be extinguished from the human consciousness. It is an undying flame, burning through the millennia, illuminating every person who turns toward truth and compassion.